When the Philadelphia Convention finally did open for business on Friday, May 25th, 1787, no one was 100% sure how to proceed. Only 31 of the 55 delegates had arrived. Robert Morris, yes, the very same Robert Morris who had once served as Superintendent of Finance for the Continental Congress, nominated George Washington to be President of the Convention. This proved a popular start as Washington received unanimous acclamation. The Assembly then appointed a secretary, although here the unanimity broke down. A divided delegation appointed Major William Jackson, a South Carolinian, to the post. He had lobbied hard to get it, and had beaten out Benjamin Franklin's own grandson. He turned out to be a lousy secretary, and his notes in the official journal he kept were a mess. We still, to this day, rely more on Madison's notes than on the official convention journal. Next, the delegates read their credentials. This should have been the sort of run-of-the-mill procedural step, but it turned out to be fraught with tensions. The Virginian credentials, and I should maybe be clear here, their credentials mean their proof of who they are and why they are at the convention. You couldn't just walk in. You had to come in and present the commission that the legislature had given you. And these commissions should have been pro forma. You know, we appoint so-and-so as commissioner of the state as a delegate to this constitutional convention to be held in Philadelphia. Instead, the Virginian credentials read this way. The crisis is arrived at, which the good people of America are to decide the solemn question, whether they will, by just and magnanimous efforts, reap the just fruits of that independence which they have cemented with so much of their common blood, or whether by giving way to unmanly jealousies and prejudices, or to partial and transitory interests, they will furnish our enemies with cause to triumph. And this was pretty overheated. It was very heavy-handed. It was bound to offend, and offend they did, by the way. George Reed of Delaware read his credentials next, upon which he announced that his state had instructed him to counter any attempt to destroy the equality of voting amongst the states. The Pennsylvania and Virginia delegations had already agreed in private, of course, that they wanted to switch the basis of representation to proportional rather than equal representation. This was to avoid allowing states like Delaware, the least populous state, to have an equal vote with the large states like Pennsylvania and Virginia. Virginia was the most populous state, by the way. So here's an ominous beginning, to say the least. The delegates next appointed a committee to prepare standing rules and orders for the convention at large, then adjourned for the weekend, leaving the committee to its task. When the convention reopened on Monday, May 28, the Rules Committee presented its report. Their most important rule was the one allowing each state to have an equal vote in the proceedings. This also likely rankled the delegates from Virginia and Pennsylvania, who had previously wanted the delegates to be able to vote in proportion to their states' populations, but the rule passed anyway. Another rule proposed by the committee was not adopted, and that was to allow any delegate to call for a vote and have them entered into the minutes at any time. Both Rufus King of Massachusetts and George Mason of Virginia objected to this rule and instead pressed the convention to be more informal, allowing votes to be taken without their being formally recorded. Another change, suggested by North Carolina's Richard Dobbs Spreight, was adopted the following day: the rule that any member of the convention be allowed to request a reconsideration of any vote already taken. This would make the proceedings of the convention even more informal, allowing them to negotiate again and again on the same issues. It would have big consequences given the nature of the task ahead of the delegates. One more rule would be adopted. Pierce Butler of South Carolina asked that the convention adopt a rule of secrecy. The delegates would promise not to publish the debates within the convention or to speak of them outside of the walls. To keep the air of secrecy, the doors and windows would be shut during the day. This was not an issue in May and even in June, but it made the delegates extremely uncomfortable in July when the Philadelphia humidity and heat arrived. With the rules thus decided, the convention adjourned for the day. On May 29th, Governor Edmund Randolph of Virginia asked for the floor. He was granted it. Then he presented the plan known to history as the Virginia Plan. When you review the Virginia Plan, think of how this must have struck the majority of delegates who were not part of the Virginia-Pennsylvania persuasion. We have some of their reactions, by the way. William Paterson of New Jersey immediately scribbled in his notes, "Objection. Sovereignty is an integral thing." Robert Yates of New York, a delegate who was committed to keeping sovereignty firmly in the states, wrote scathingly of Randolph's, quote, "long and elaborate speech," end quote. And indeed, it took up most of the day's proceedings. But Randolph was not alone. Charles Pinckney of South Carolina also presented a plan. We do not know what was in the Pinckney plan, partially because Madison made no record of it in his notes. Later, well after the Constitution was in operation, Pinckney represented his plan as being very close to the final draft of the Constitution. James Madison hotly disputed this in the 1820s and the 1830s. We'll leave this matter aside for the moment, but it is one of history's curious mysteries. Historians have tended to favor Madison's side in this, but the evidence is slim enough that we can never be sure precisely what it was that Pinckney presented. For the month of June and half of July, the delegates spent their time arguing about representation in the national legislature. To be sure, other issues surfaced and were debated, but it was clear that the central issue would be how political power would be proportioned. Several issues stood out. One was the transformation from a unicameral to a bicameral national legislature. This was nothing radical, to be sure, but it did represent a fundamental change to the Articles of Confederation. It also opened up the possibility for compromise. On June 11th, Roger Sherman of Connecticut proposed the first version of the Great Compromise, or what would come to be known as the Connecticut Compromise. This was the idea that representation be split, that it be apportioned according to population in the lower house and by state in the upper house. Sherman had hit upon what would be the solution in this, but it would still take a month to cement its details. And one byproduct of this debate was the insistence by small state delegates that the upper house be selected by the states through their legislatures. The big state delegates were unhappy with the idea of an equality of representation in either house, let alone with this latter idea. But they very quite quickly relented on it. Also on June 11th, James Wilson of Pennsylvania motioned that the lower house be proportioned according to free inhabitants plus 3/5 of all others, by which he meant slaves. He was immediately seconded by Charles Pinckney of South Carolina. The 3/5 principle had been introduced by a Northerner and a Southerner together, and in time, of course, it would stick. A second issue was the problem of providing some means of checking the national legislature. Given the open-ended grant of power in the Virginia Plan, as well as the planned veto over state laws, the national legislature was beginning to look more and more like the British Parliament, a supreme body that was both the source and the judge of its own power. Madison at this point articulated a departmentalist check. We know this now as the separation of powers, but the word that was used most frequently at the time was departmental check. Madison suggested a joint executive judicial council of revision that would be able to review federal laws and suggest revisions. His thinking was that the two weaker branches, the executive and the judicial, could unite to counter the admitted superiority of the legislative branch. An interesting objection to this arose from delegates who asserted that this would weaken the ability of judges to declare acts unconstitutional from the bench after their enactment. Here was the idea of judicial review at the convention, an assumed power that would never make it into the Constitution's text, but it was present, as it were, at the creation. The small states did attempt to grab the initiative. On Friday, June 15, William Paterson of New Jersey proposed a plan entirely different from the Virginia Plan, which would come to be known as the New Jersey Plan. It was the small state attempt to maintain the integral sovereignty of the states. The following Monday, June 18th, Alexander Hamilton presented his plan. Hamilton's plan was essentially patterned after the British monarchical system, enough so that many delegates found it to be dangerously anti-republican. Many historians have speculated that Hamilton's plan was designed not just to discredit the New Jersey Plan, but to make the Virginia Plan appear modest in comparison to his own. The next day, on June 19th, the New Jersey Plan went down in defeat. On July 2nd, the Connecticut Compromise came up for a vote and very narrowly escaped defeat. 5 states voting for it, 5 against, and 1 state delegation divided. Noticeably, 1 delegate from Maryland was not present and whose vote would have divided the delegation at least if we take his prior votes as a basis. Why he was absent is not known, but the effect was remarkable. The convention immediately voted for the appointment of a grand committee composed of one member from each state, which would report back to the convention after the July 4th weekend. The grand committee was composed primarily of people favorable to the Connecticut Compromise. It would become the solution to a month and a half of cantankerous debate. James Madison was disappointed by now. Not only had he lost on the principle of representation, but his legislative veto over state laws had been jettisoned by the convention as well. In its place was a weak statement about the supremacy of federal law over state law. Other aspects of the Constitution's structure took place during this time and after. The presidency, for instance, was once conceived of as a ministerial office, eventually took on more powers. The convention decided against an executive council, for instance, settling on a single office to embody the executive power. The appointment of judges and other officers, at first lodged in the Senate, became a joint power in a report issued by a committee on postponed parts on September 4th, as the convention's business was winding down. Presidential election would be done by electors, whose votes would be apportioned by state according to the total number of representatives and senators that the state possessed. Disputed elections, which might occur frequently, given that each elector cast 2 votes for president, were to be settled in the House of Representatives, voting by state delegations. This was an ingenious solution, by the way, proposed by Roger Sherman for what was a major problem at the time. It kept a Republican-Democratic veneer on the presidency and allayed fears that the president would become a tool of the Senate. I have stepped out of time here to describe the presidency as an evolving office during the convention, but I hope the point is clear. The delegates had no clear conception of the office of president, and its development occurred within the Madisonian framework of departmental integrity. Much of the Constitution's substance came out of another committee report, the Committee of Detail. It originated on July 23, when Elbridge Gerry proposed that a committee be appointed to prepare a report of the Constitution based upon all of the agreements made up to that point. It was an attempt at the time to take the remnants of the Virginia Plan and all other things agreed upon and turn them into a coherent draft of a Constitution that the body might pick up and work with. The committee, composed of 5 members, met first on July 27th. Edmund Randolph, the committee's draftsman, put together the report, and as he did so, he laid out 2 principles that were to be extremely important to the final draft of the Constitution. First, to insert essential principle only, lest the operations of government should be clogged by rendering those provisions permanent and unalterable which ought to be accommodated to times and events. And second, to use simple and precise language and general propositions according to the example of the constitutions of the several states. For the construction of a constitution of necessity differs from that of law. Although these words never made it into the Constitution itself, or even into the report, these principles guided the framers throughout. And think for a moment precisely what this second point means, that the construction of a constitution differs from that of the construction of law. It's a critical point, and it would animate many debates following the convention. In the month and a half after the committee presented its report, the convention moved much more quickly and smoothly. The most cantankerous debate turned on the question of commercial law. Southern states wanted a supermajority in the legislature to pass regulations on commerce. The South Carolina delegates relented on this point quite famously when delegates from Connecticut brokered a compromise that would exchange a simple majority requirement for commerce laws for a protection of the slave trade. This is the Slave Trade Compromise. South Carolina delegates introduced one more protection for slavery, a fugitive slave clause. This was adopted without much debate and was adopted unanimously. In the waning days of the convention, a committee of style was appointed to smooth out the rough edges and produce a final draft of the Constitution. Gouverneur Morris took up his pen and produced a draft with remarkable stylistic differences that would later play a great role in constitutional interpretation. First, he changed the form of the document. Rather than a list of 34 independent articles, he organized the Constitution into 7 articles. he also arranged them in a particular way, and this meant rearranging the articles themselves in some cases. He was not above adding words, changing them, or even inserting clauses, such as the Contracts Clause, that had not been in the draft that he was given. The document that came out of the Committee of Style was, in many ways, a new kind of document. And as you look at the Constitution itself, think of its form, its function, and its organization. All these disparate elements came together in the first document. Any serious analysis of the Constitution's text must begin with this understanding of what the framers were doing and how their politicking, bargaining, and cavorting shaped the substance of the final document. So, too, we must understand that it was not a single mind, but rather the genius of all these different committees that produced the final document.